Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I am here with my Uber boss, I guess, Steve Forbes, chairman, editor-in-chief of Forbes Media, and author of many, many books, including Inflation, which I think is very pertinent to this conversation. So welcome.
Thank you.
So Silicon Valley Bank and this whole digital run on the banks, is this a banking crisis? Is that what we're facing right now, or how would you describe it?
There's always a tendency to fight the last war, the last one being 2008, 2009.
Right.
And then banks were loaded with bad debt, bad loans, inadequately capitalized, very, very high leverage. What's happened since 2008, 2009, including Basel III, as they call it, all the international banks, the biggies, have to meet certain capital requirements, is that the banking system as a whole is very well capitalized. That's why in the Federal Reserve has brimming amounts of reserves from banks because they're paying them a nice rate of interest. So there's not a lack of liquidity in the banking system. What you saw happen in Silicon Valley with that bank, which is sad because everyone talks about the great service they provided. That's why the startups went there. They got treated by people who knew what they were doing, what they needed, the services they needed, and everything else. But it was a classic mistake of taking short-term liabilities and long-term assets. When you take $80 billion of 10-year mortgages at an interest rate of 1.8%, and you have
interest rates are going
and interest rates are going up, and you don't bother to hedge, you got a problem. And when you got in trouble, they did not reach out the way they should have, as a normal bank would, and say, "We got a problem. And they would have to dilute the equity, but there would have been equity at the end of the day. The bank easily could have been saved.
Well,
So it's a different crisis. But what's happened, this gets to the root of it, is that after 2008, 2009, with no empirical evidence at all the central banks, led by the Federal Reserve, decided we need a low interest rate environment. And so they suppressed interest rates, not just short, but long-term interest rates. That's why they loaded up on long-term bonds, which central banks never did. They might have a few, but mostly was short-term paper. And so they loaded up by the trillions and suppressed interest rates. Politicians loved it. Why? Because they could now spend and borrow, and the cost went down.
Yeah.
It'd be like taking your credit card, borrowing $20,000, and your monthly payment goes down. Hey, what's not to like? So what's happened over a generation, people got used to thinking that low rates were here forever for whatever reason. And so as a result, countries got over indebted. A lot of companies that could borrow. Companies that didn't need to borrowed. Why would Apple borrow tens of billions of dollars? Because it was free.
Yeah.
And the interest was deductible. So you skewed the credit markets. You put a lot of people in jeopardy as soon as rates started to rise and you started to pay real interest rates with inflation, which is what happens when you have lockdowns and easy money in the sense of reducing the value of your currency. You got a big problem. And so what's amazing is so far we haven't had a big international crisis yet. I don't know what country will precipitate it or what institution will precipitate it abroad. But here at home, it's not just a few banks that are going to be in trouble. A lot of companies are suddenly going to be left half.
Well, that's interesting because I think obviously this is a case where they came in and they rescued the depositors. The creditors, to your point, I guess in essence.
Well, the creditors, they realized that if they wanted to avoid the word bailout.
Right.
And so what they made sure was the unsecured creditors get wiped out. They made sure the shareholders are going to get wiped out. They made sure the managers are going to get fired. They would have been fired anyway, but they're going to get fired, and any who take bonuses, I guarantee you, are going to be clawed back. So they try to cover themselves politically, say we're just saving the depositors. That short term works. But longer term, are you going to have a situation where people don't care where they put their money because it's all insured, no matter where,
right.
No matter what
all
the bank does.
Are off, right?
Yes, and so a bank can offer, now they say, well, regulation will prevent it. Well, regulation, more and more regulation means banks will have less latitude to make loans. We were chatting earlier, before we came on here, that once upon a time, local banks were the biggest source of money for startups. They knew a local company, they would take a flyer on it. And that doesn't happen anymore. Regulations won't permit it.
Well, so we tend to learn lessons after these, or so we hope to learn lessons. And let's take the lessons potentially for Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell. And I know you've spoken in the past about the Fed's policy. Now we've certainly seen some consequences of the rapidity of the hikes. People are waiting, thinking, will he hike yet again? They maybe this time last week, perhaps they thought differently. Do you get the sense that there is a bit of a wake-up call there in terms of what's happened?
The two big mistakes the banks made, central banks, I don't know whether they're going to learn the lesson, at least with these regimes. One is suppressing interest rates is like rent control. It destroys and distorts a market. And how did they? And so they went. They all did it. Bought globs of bonds. Had negative interest rates. Never in human history have rates been as low as they've been since around 2009, 2010. And so the lesson is let the market set the rates. And the other thing they have is this weird concept of inflation, 2%. Where did that come from? From a guy in New Zealand at a central bank there who posited in the 1980s.
The optimal.
Well, that seems like a good rate. Again, no research supports that, real research, but they all adopted it. The Federal Reserve finally formally adopted 2%. Well, that's better than zero, because if you're at zero, it might go to deflation, which is the end of the world. And how do you measure it? They have all their different favorite measurements. It's preposterous. Central banks should have only two duties, unless you want to put regulatory powers with them as well. One is keep the currency stable and deal with the occasional panic, whether it comes from a war, an attack, natural disaster, whatever. You deal with the emergency. And even there, they haven't learned the full lesson of what the Bank of England taught back in the 1860s, which invented a lender of last resort, was you charge an above-market interest rate. So, yeah, you bring in your collateral, get the short-term loan, get the cash you need so you don't have to go under like happened with our friends in Silicon Valley. But you have an incentive to quickly pay it down as fast as possible. Instead, after 2008, 2009, the thing was, let's keep this going forever.
Well, let's talk about the lessons of history, since we're talking about, when you mentioned, of course, 2008, I've heard comparisons to Bear Stearns, which, what is a good analogy when you look at sort of what the current situation is and the risks that systemically we face at this point, the U.S. economy and otherwise? Would you be pointing to a different period in history to get some real lessons as to how this could, the ripple effect and what could happen from here?
Well, the question, it's not just the disaster; it's what you do in response to the disaster.
Right.
And you take the biggest of them all, the Great Depression. It precipitated the
last bank run.
the 1929. What precipitated the Depression was the big tariff bill that the U.S. passed called Smoot-Hawley, which destroyed the global trading system. And you look at the history of that legislation, when it looked like it was going to be a reality in the fall of 29, the market cratered. Amazingly, when that legislation got sidetracked, the market had a huge recovery. Then, like a monster in a movie, it came back again and eventually became law. 26 nations immediately retaliated and then blew up the system. That was followed by other mistakes, various controls, raising taxes. In this country, we raised the top income tax rate from about 25% to 63% overnight, and put on a lot of excise tax. Excise taxes are sales tax on specific items. They even put a tax on checks. You wrote a check during the Depression in the United States, you paid a tax. How crazy is that? What were the three big countries that raised taxes big time? U.S., Britain, and Germany. We saw what that led to in Germany, especially in the wake of their hyperinflation in the early 20s.
Is the economy doing well from where you sit?
Well, what's amazing is how well the economy is done, given the abuses that have been piled on it. But they're going to have consequences. The economy is slowing. Now, whether the economic theologians ever call it a recession, it is a slowdown. We're going the way of Europe, where, we're growing 1%, hooray. You need a microscope to find the growth rates, maybe 2%. We are accustomed in this country to do 3.5% over a period of time. So we're way, way below what we should be. And when Biden says, oh, the economy's doing, I remember Herbert Hoover. Yeah, prosperity is just around the corner. Hoover was the Depression president. Right. And Roosevelt, happy days are here again. Well, when you look at the numbers, no, they weren't. And so in terms of the economy, we should be reducing tax rates. We should be reducing regulations. And I wish the Democrats, for example, would go back and look at Jimmy Carter. He made a mess of energy, but on transportation, they've made huge strides in deregulation. They turned despite what's happened in Ohio, the freight industry in this country is the best in the world, by far. And that happened 40 years ago. The freight industry, railroad industry, has gone broke. They deregulated it. They did the same thing with trucks. They did the same thing with airplanes. Despite all the hassles at the airport, airfares today, in real terms, are about 50, 60% lower than they were 40 years ago. It was Democrats that did that. So brush up on your history, guys. You've got some good history.
Rhetoric on the GOP side. I want to mention the fact that several days ago, I know you were at a book event where you had some protesters that came in. I don't know if it was you personally, but they were there. They threw a drink at you, and talk about that. Like, that said to me something about anger and just, I'm not even sure what to make of that, but you've been all over the news with it. Just tell us what happened.
Oh, it's not the way that one wants liquidity.
On your suit, right?
Well, that's a good thing about a dark suit. It doesn't show up quite as much. But a co-author, she had a trained dress because she was soaked. And they knocked the books over and everything like that. This is unique, but the discontent is not unique.
Yeah.
And when you have a society where people really are doubting about the future, where authority is not believed anymore, the way the health authorities handled the pandemic was a disaster, contradictory, not telling us the truth because they thought that we couldn't handle it. Yeah. The high distrust. And so you started to see it in the Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street years ago.
Yeah.
And that relates to when you don't have a stable currency. John Maynard Keynes, the great British economist, said in a situation like that, not one in a million understands what's happening, but it undermines social trust. It's acidic. It undermines civil authority. You look for scapegoats. Back in Roman times, they blamed the inflation of the emperors on Christians. The lions didn't mind, but it didn't solve Rome's problem.
Who's the scapegoat now? I know there's rhetoric.
Well, and in the medieval times, they had witches. Witches were seen as causing inflation. The scapegoats today, pick your day, whether it's greedy companies, greedy food processors, greedy energy companies, just take greedy and put some...
I've seen the term greedy put next to Silicon Valley Bank. So
now that's another. But the thing is, it's corrosive, and so it sounds trite to say it or simplistic. But when you have good times, when people think things are getting better, great innovations are coming along, like happened in the 20s or 60s or 80s. Silicon Valley emerged as a world force in the 80s. People calm down.
It's true. We feel magnanimous almost. There's like more than enough seats and more than enough to go around.
And people start to have faith in the future. And when you look at what's happening in technology, in terms it's staggering. Everyone...
The opportunity or the fears?
Well, there are fears, but the opportunities are enormous. I mean,
yeah.
There was once a great cartoon, I think it was in the New Yorker, of somebody fearful of light bulbs, didn't want to touch light bulbs, take out light bulbs because she feared the...
Larry David crypto commercials, right? The wheel?
Yeah, the third one, I think it was, that electricity was going to come out of the socket and get you. One of the great characters in fiction, Frankenstein, was a reaction to the rise of electricity.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And somebody pointed out, artificial intelligence is a terrible name. He said, you don't call airplanes artificial birds.
Yeah.
You don't call cars artificial horses.
It's not a substitute for us, basically.
Oh, no, it's a tool.
Yeah.
We create, it's a tool. It makes, as has been pointed out, it does to the human mind what machines did for human muscle.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we are not going to be Olympic weightlifters. We can do 1,000 times more physical stuff than an Olympic weightlifter could have done 200 years ago because of technology.
Right.
So it's a tool, but people don't believe it. They fear. They think they're going to lose things, and they don't trust anybody. They don't trust the future. So yeah, and so if you
I mean, being Canadian, it's something I've always loved about the States is the optimism. Before I let you go, I do want to just pivot a little bit back to the rest of the world, because we've seen China now brokering a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Obviously, still ongoing concern, if that's the right way to put it, about what Putin is doing, and the question of U.S. engagement. I mean, politically, but also on the trade front. What are you looking at, and what would you be looking at in terms of even some of the risks we've seen play out here in the U.S.? Are they going to be playing out in other economies, given, the financial situations that they're in?
Well, talk about economics. In Europe, they're all giddy because instead of a recession, they may have flat, or maybe 1%. That's nice, but it's not what the future's going to be. It's not going to solve their problems.
Yeah.
In terms of geopolitically, there was a book several years ago, came out, the slew of them came out in 2014, and for 100th anniversary of the start of the First World War. Mm-hmm. And one of them was entitled The Sleepwalkers, about how diplomats really didn't know what they were doing as they walked into this catastrophe. And I think we see the sleepwalkers today in U.S. security. They've let China run everywhere. They've Saudi Arabia, we gratuitously slapped them aside, and so China reached out to them. We underestimated what Putin's game is, even though he has written what his intentions are for Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It's to obliterate them and undermine Europe on all post-World War II security arrangements in Europe. And there's no sense of urgency. No sense of, we got to get things going like we did in the 1980s, belatedly we did in the late 30s, early 40s. One thing Franklin Roosevelt did right was realize that he's got to get the U.S. Economy industrially ready for a coming war, even though at the time no one thought the U.S. would be involved. He had the foresight to see we better be ready. As he saw in the First World War, we weren't ready, and not a good thing. So anyway, in terms of today, people talk about it, but they don't realize how ugly this situation is getting and what it's going to take to do it. And it's not just more armaments, not just more research, R&D, and that kind of thing. When you have, as we saw in the 80s, a buoyant economy, Silicon Valley was not the Pentagon, but people could see in terms of cutting-edge technology, the U.S. was where it was at. And the Soviet Union realized, oh my God, we've got all this rusty, old industrial stuff. They're hopelessly behind. So that's how you do it. You play to your strengths. That's why with that chip bill they passed, we got to revive the chip industry. The chip industry started to revive. NVIDIA stock is even doing okay today.
Yeah.
But instead they're going to, China's doing, we should do it too. No. Let them play their game. We can play our game, play to our strengths. So the sleepwalkers are there, and they don't connect the dots between a vibrant economy, an innovating economy, coming up with stuff people couldn't even dream of, and national security and staying power. And one of the things that I think we should take some heart from is when Ukraine was invaded a little over a year ago, the West responded in a way that no one foresaw. No one foresaw.
Stronger NATO, or what did they?
Stronger NATO, that we respond, providing weapons. Now, the problem is, in terms of providing weapons to Ukraine, it's always been the old phrase, day late, dollar short. Not giving them, they could have won this war by now if we'd provided the aircraft and other weapon systems. But they thought, Putin might get upset. Boo-hoo. And he wasn't going to use nukes because the Chinese said, no, don't cross that threshold. We don't want Japan and South Korea getting the idea. They have to have nukes.
Yeah.
So we misplayed the hand there. But anyway, one of the little facet of good news is there's now a bipartisan bill in the Senate from Senator Coons of Delaware and Senator Thune of South Dakota, paving the way to give the president authority to negotiate a free trade agreement with Britain. And I got sidetracked a few years ago. It's bringing it back. That's what we need to do. If we conclude a free trade agreement with Britain, that tells the rest of the world we're not going to go binging on protectionism, set a model for others, be good for our economies, be good for our defense industries as they meld together. So I'm looking at that saying maybe little flower there is something we should look at.
A sign of hope. Good.
Sign of hope.
A sign of hope. Well, let's end that, and thanks for joining us, Steve.